when we were making our list of all of these projects that the UN bought carbon credits from, we looked up the names of the projects in a normal search engine and also on environmental databases to see if they were involved in any complaints by local communities. And what we found is that at least a dozen of them were the target of mass protests in some cases, that they had been accused of displacing people, particularly in China, and of not adequately compensating those communities. One of them was in Brazil. It's a large hydropower dam. In order to build it, the company blew up a holy site that was in an indigenous community. There was a section of the river that the indigenous community there considered sacred to them, and it was blown up. You wouldn't really expect a project that the UN says is helping the climate to actually be involved in deforestation and displacing indigenous people and their ability to worship.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Jacob Goldberg. Jacob is a reporter at the New Humanitarian who recently did a year-long investigation with Mongabay into the UN's claims that it is a climate-neutral organization. The result of that investigation is perhaps what listeners of this podcast have come to expect. Not only is the United Nations not a climate-neutral organization, Jacob and his colleagues found that some of the projects they are using to offset their emissions are actually causing environmental damage to land, to ecosystems, and to indigenous peoples. Jacob joins me to explain the investigation, delving into greater details about the shocking results. We discuss the different kinds of carbon credits that are available to buy and how they are ranked, with Jacob revealing that the UN, despite this ranking system, doesn't even discriminate between available projects. This is a far-ranging conversation on this topic, given I have also investigated carbon credits in my climate corruption journalism. And through it, we discuss the systemic issues of the climate crisis, the fact that it is a symptom of a much deeper problem of extraction, corruption, exploitation, and a lack of imagination, leaving us with the question, if such problems have infiltrated every single institution, how can we expect them to guide humanity through the crisis? I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Jacob, thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
And thank you for making the time so last minute as well. Just as keen to get you on to discuss this investigation. But before we go into that, I'm going to start with the first normal question, which is, why is the world in crisis?
This is a question that has come up a lot since I started this investigation into the UN carbon credits. Now that I've had to do a lot of reading about why we're living through various climate crises and been asked, is there anything we can do about it? Is there any positive story you could tell? Do we need to always have such gloomy stories about the climate? Yeah, I've grappled with it a lot. I've not come up with a positive story to tell. In fact, the more I read about it, I feel like, and I'm not an expert, I'm just a journalist. So I do this research just while reporting for stories. But if I could narrow down the cause of why the world is the way it is, I would say it's because governments are subsidizing fossil fuels that they're false, that they're subsidizing them at all, and especially at the expense of renewable energy. And the climate crisis is the result of greenhouse gas emissions that are the result of burning fossil fuels. There are decent proposals for how renewable energy could be adopted at a greater scale with government support. That's just not happening now. And so we have this constant outflow of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that's making the world warmer, that's causing disasters. And that's the result of government decisions. And obviously there's a ideology and interests that underlie those decisions. Speaking personally, I would say capitalism is definitely one of them. But yeah, I think if I had to narrow it down, that's what I'd say.
Could you expand quickly on government subsidies of fossil fuels at the expense of renewable energy?
Yeah, I wish I could. It's not the subject of my investigation, but I think if you look at experts' recommendations for what needs to happen immediately in order to prevent the atmosphere from warming 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, is that fossil fuel consumption needs to end immediately. But if fossil fuel consumption ended immediately, we would lose the comforts and luxuries and technologies that we've all become accustomed to. Our civilization would collapse. What could sustain our way of living if we were to give up fossil fuels? It's other sources of energy, but those are not there. So when I say that governments are subsidizing fossil fuels at the expense of renewable energies, it's because they have this money to invest in sources of energy, but they are not putting it toward what would slow the pace of climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's lots of different theories as to why, but the geopolitical tensions between sort of the biggest renewable energy producer in the world and the biggest fossil fuel run superpower in the world is no doubt at play here, at the expense of life on Earth currently.
Yeah, you're right.
But this isn't an episode about superpowers. It's about the NGOs that support them. So how is it that you came into investigating the carbon credits of the UN, or the UN's claim, that it's carbon neutral?
Right. Yeah. So I started with, well, let me just say to start off, I work at the New Humanitarian, which is an outlet that covers humanitarian crises and the humanitarian aid sector. We very frequently report on the UN and its involvement in humanitarian aid, but we also report on climate change because it's one of the biggest factors in why humanitarian crises happen. In 2021, my colleagues investigated the aid sector's carbon footprint, trying to calculate their annual emissions. And one thing that my colleagues came across was a claim by the UN to be almost completely climate neutral. And what does it mean
carbon
to be
neutral?
They use the term climate neutral.
Climate neutral?
Climate neutral, correct? Yeah.
What does that mean?
It's used almost interchangeably. I think that there was just these terms. I'll get ahead of myself and say these are greenwashing. These are greenwashing terms, and I think they change every once in a while to suit whatever public messaging need is required. People still say carbon neutral. People started saying climate neutral more recently. I guess that might be because carbon is not the only greenhouse gas. When they say climate neutral, including the UN, what they mean is they don't have any impact on climate change. They're saying that despite all the fossil fuels they burn, which they obviously do, that's not raising the absolute amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Somehow they're able to burn millions of tons, or they're able to emit millions of metric tons of greenhouse gases, but those don't go on. Those are not. Those are stricken from the record. Why? Because they buy carbon credits, which theoretically offset their emissions. So that's where the question came from. They're climate neutral, they say. The UN claims not, or implicitly claims not to have any contribution to climate change, and that's because of carbon credits. So we decided to investigate that claim. If they claim to be climate neutral, which is a very bold claim, and they use carbon credits, we wanted to figure out how exactly that works. And yeah, we did come pretty close to figuring it out. I would say we did.
I would say you did too from your
Yeah,
results. Um, so the investigation took around a year, from what I understand.
that's right.
And what exactly were you investigating? Were you investigating the validity of these carbon credits, investigating how they are used, whether or not they exist, the organizations they're linked to? What was the systemic overview of things that you were looking at?
It was all of the above. I think what we needed to do from the beginning was to collect a list of offsetting projects that produced the UN's carbon credits. And let me explain a little bit. Carbon credits, when you say, you mentioned how carbon credits are used, they're not really used because they're not physical things. They're just an idea, and it's an idea that it's an idea that says somewhere in the world, 1 metric ton of greenhouse gas, specifically carbon dioxide, was prevented from being emitted. Because that was prevented from being emitted, I can now emit 1 metric ton of greenhouse gas, and I am not contributing to climate change. So
Madness.
how can you how can that 1 metric ton be prevented from being emitted? It's because there are these programs, they call them projects, all over the world that that do various things. They can produce renewable energy through hydropower or wind. They can make factories more efficient. They can capture and destroy potent greenhouse gases. They can capture methane from coal mines and prevent it from going into the atmosphere. So they calculate how much those projects calculate how much greenhouse gas they're preventing from entering the atmosphere, and then they through that, using that calculation, they sell a certain number of credits, and the UN has bought millions of those credits, and those credits vary in quality according to experts. We didn't do any of our own scientific assessments of the projects that the UN bought credits from. We relied on existing expertise, and it's a vast body of research. But what we found was pretty much that the UN bought millions of credits from the types of projects that experts consider to be of the lowest quality, the least likely to have actually reduced carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So that was one important finding. And like you said, we also wanted to see if there were any connections between the projects that produced the UN's carbon credits and human rights abuses or any other environmental damage. And yes, personally, I didn't expect to find that, but we did find that in at least a dozen cases.
All right. Okay. Let's go through this and break it down then. Number one, the UN buying sort of low grade carbon credits. How is that? Because carbon is a gas. So sure, it doesn't have a quality metric. So how is it that there can be credits that are higher quality and lower quality?
Yeah, exactly. You're right. It's not about the quality of any type of gas. It's about the likelihood of the project to actually reduce greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. And the way that experts determine whether a project is likely or unlikely to actually achieve that reduction that it claims to is it's a concept called additionality. And we agonized over whether to explain this concept in our piece because there's not many contexts in which you have to use or understand it, except in the conversation we're having right now. But I'm glad we're having it. So additionality is a requirement for an offsetting project to be able to produce credits. And it means that the reductions in greenhouse gases that project achieves. So let me give an example. Um, let's say we're talking about a hydropower dam. It claims it's reduced greenhouse gas in the atmosphere because it's produced energy that would have otherwise come from fossil fuels. So because it created, let's say, a million metric tons, or let's say it produced enough energy to prevent a million metric tons of greenhouse gases from going in the atmosphere, because that energy would have otherwise come from fossil fuels, it can then sell a million carbon credits. But what additionality requires of that project is for it to prove that those reductions would not have happened anyway. It has to prove that that energy, that renewable energy, would not have been produced anyway. And what's the biggest factor determining whether a hydropower dam gets built, whether a hydropower dam can produce renewable energy? The biggest factor is not whether it can sell carbon credits. The biggest factor is whether it has support from the local government and whether it's profitable. And in most cases, these dams are profitable, or at least economically viable, because they sell energy. If it doesn't require revenue from the sale of carbon credits to come into existence in the first place, then its reductions would have happened anyway. And it should not be allowed to sell carbon credits based on those alleged reductions. That's what the experts say. That's what the project's own principles say. But the carbon credit market is contaminated with thousands of projects that would have been built regardless of their ability to sell carbon credits. And therefore, according to experts, they shouldn't be allowed to sell carbon credits.
Oh, it's so fascinating. It's amazing how like economic think speak double nonsense has like genuinely managed to convince even government officials that the world can be organized according to how you think it is. Like like this whole concept of, I mean, we'll keep going to the details, but this whole concept of like, I'm going to emit into the atmosphere, but it's actually not going to go into the atmosphere because there's trees over there. No, 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 no.
Yeah.
At what point did physics like, and it, at what point did physics go, oh yeah, we're just like accounting. You can just balance our books, no problem. Like, it is absolute madness. And anybody that thinks about it for more than half a second kind of comes to that conclusion. But it's really managed to convince a lot of experts, well, not carbon credit experts and not scientists, but a lot of government officials, that this is the way forward, because it is the way forward that promises business as usual.
Exactly. I mean, that was the entire reason why carbon credits were devised in the first place, or at least the ones that the UN buys. They come from this UN-run program called the Clean Development Mechanism, and it was devised during the Kyoto Protocol negotiations in the 90s as a way to allow rich countries to say that they're contributing to fighting climate change, but without actually divesting from fossil fuels, which would be very costly and harmful to their economies. Instead, they could theoretically reduce emissions abroad, and by supporting offsetting projects abroad. But yeah, like the experts say, those are not all of equal quality. And another critique that is often that carbon credits often receive is that they serve as permission for companies and for wealthy countries to actually emit more. So let's say I bought one carbon credit, and then I feel like I can emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide, but then I find out that that carbon credit was low quality. So then not only am I not climate neutral, I've actually increased the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So these can be very harmful.
Yeah, let's talk about that harm as well. You said that there was a second class of these carbon credits that the UN was buying that are actually causing environmental damage or harm to local and indigenous peoples.
Yes. So when we were making our list of all of these projects that the UN bought carbon credits from, we looked up the names of the projects in a normal search engine and also on environmental databases to see if they were involved in any complaints by local communities. And what we found is that at least a dozen of them were the target of mass protests in some cases, that they had been accused of displacing people, particularly in China, and of not adequately compensating those communities. There's there's a couple that we focused on. One of them was in Brazil. It's a large hydropower dam, and Mongabay, our partners in reporting this investigation, they had previously reported that this dam, the Teles Pires Dam, that's in the Amazon, in order to build it, the company blew up a holy site that was in an indigenous community. There was a section of the river that the indigenous community there considered sacred to them, and it was blown up. And parts of the forest were destroyed. So you wouldn't really expect a project that the UN says is helping the climate to actually be involved in deforestation and displacing indigenous people and their ability to worship.
That's awful. Imagine, um, like imagine telling the French, yeah, we're going to dam up the Seine and build a hydropower dam, and we're going to blow up Notre Dame in order to get it done. You know, like it's unthinkable.
Yeah, I mean, it would be if it wasn't so common, I guess.
Yeah, very well said. There is, I think it really betrays this sort of still colonial hierarchical mindset, which, you know, along the spectrum becomes white supremacism, where other cultures, other ways of life, other beings are just not at all respected. And, you know, anything that stands in the way of the system that needs to continuously expand is up for destruction.
Yeah, I think I agree.
So you found out that, do you have a percentage, like how many of the projects were bad?
Yeah, so they can be bad in different ways, and like I said, we didn't scientifically evaluate all of the projects to find out their quality. That only experts can do that, and there's professional ratings agencies that do that and give them ratings. So we cross-referenced some of the projects in our database with some that a professional ratings agency called B0 that are based in London had already rated. There weren't that many. There was a couple dozen, I think, but most of them had low ratings. So I'm not saying that's statistically significant, but it showed us that if you take a random sample of what we found and run it and give it a rating, you're not finding high quality projects. We also compared our findings to something called the Carbon Offset Guide, which is a manual published by the Stockholm Environment Institute and the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute that gives, I think it's a great resource for understanding how carbon credits work, but it also groups different types of projects into low, medium, or high risk. So by types of projects, I mean, how does it achieve emissions or claim to achieve emissions? And those are the various types that I outlined before. Does it capture and destroy greenhouse gases? Does it replace fossil fuels with renewable energy? What we found is that more than 40%, more than 50% of the projects in our database that we found that the UN had bought credits from came from project types that were high risk, meaning they are likely to be the lowest quality. More than half. And then within that, about 40% came from wind and hydropower projects. And these are the two types of projects that experts can criticize most easily and I think do most often, because these are the ones that are most likely to be profitable without the sale of carbon credits and therefore should not be allowed to sell carbon credits. So 40% of what the UN bought came from these project types that are considered low quality.
Good God. I suppose that leads us on to who at the UN is buying these? Like, do we know what their framework is for choosing these projects? Because it's either desperate incompetence or desperate incompetence. I can't really think of what another option would be.
That is a very good question. I actually want to give credit to the UNFCCC, which is the UN's entity that focuses on climate change. I wouldn't have been able to put together a database of the UN's carbon credits if they hadn't supplied it to me. It did take months. I did have to ask repeatedly for this data, for records of what credits they bought and what projects they came from, but ultimately they did supply it. And that allowed us to analyze the patterns and come to these conclusions that the UN had not bought very high quality carbon credits. But to answer your question, the UNFCCC, they're the entity that buys carbon credits on behalf of most other UN entities. And when we put our findings to them, they did not answer any questions about any specific projects or project types. They said that they rely on the standards of the Clean Development Mechanism, which, like I said earlier, was the UN-run program that came from the Kyoto Protocol negotiations that issues these credits in the first place. It has its own standards. They say that these projects are vetted, and the UNFCCC relies on those standards in the belief that each credit is of equal quality and successfully reduces 1 metric ton of greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. They also said, my response to that is that that's a very outdated position to take. The Clean Development Mechanism has been criticized for the same reasons I've been talking about for more than a decade. I think if you ask any carbon credit expert, they will tell you that there are lots of low quality credits available there, and the experts who are most generous toward the concept of carbon credits would say, if you're going to buy from the Clean Development Mechanism, you have to make sure you're buying the highest quality. The UN does not do that. They treat them all as equal, and they even told me that they are not chosen at all. They are assigned randomly and indiscriminately. So they come in bulk, and there is no thought to how these carbon credits end up in the UN's portfolio.
God, what a way to get yourself off the hook. Hey.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hang on. Hold up. With these... So I assume a lot of these projects were voluntary projects as well.
Well, what do you mean by that?
Because there's a voluntary carbon credit market, and then there's the governmental ones.
Right. So I think the Clean Development Mechanism was created for governments to offset their emissions, but an individual or an organization can voluntarily buy credits from it. So I think all of its credits are available to either an individual, an organization, or a country. But most countries, I think most countries stopped buying from the Clean Development Mechanism in 2012 or 2013 because of quality concerns.
God, 10 years ago. Right. Okay.
Yeah. There's a lot that I ended up reporting in this story that could have been reported 10 years ago. It would have been, it would have been more timely then, but I guess this specific question hadn't arisen by then.
True, but I think also to be fair to our kin, our journalistic kin, apparently it doesn't seem to matter how much you report on a thing. Like things just very rarely change. It takes one hell of an investigation, and typically an investigation that feels quite like salacious and exciting to sort of like grab public interest, at least. Carbon credits, like Mongabay broke that first story in late 2021 around the 80 billion deal in Sabah, Malaysia, in which like all of the forests have been handed over to this company that had just been created like overnight, that with people that had no backing in carbon credits, that were linked to the kingmaker of the state, and the indigenous people hadn't given their free prior informed consent. It was a 100-year deal that had a clause in the contract that said any future governments that cancel this will have to pay a loss of profits to this company. And it's like, it's so obviously a scam. It's so obviously a scam. Mongabay reported on it. Sarawak reported on it. I tried to help out as well, and the Mongabay have kept doing it. I've kept doing it, like just article after article after article. Ketan Joshi on Twitter and Blue Sky, and as a climate comms expert, like we're all constantly sounding the alarm.
Mm-hmm.
And it just doesn't change anything. I mean, look at that Guardian investigation that came out in January around Vera. Like 90% of credits sold on the voluntary market are fake. They don't
Mm-hmm.
exist. And UN's like, oh yeah, I guess we'll just, tweak Vera a little bit. But it's still the backbone of all major policy. Sorry, I know it's your interview, but now I'm ranting.
Go
And then
on.
what we see, that happens in January. And then this summer, we see that an Emirati company is buying up 10% of the landmass in Liberia to
Mm-hmm.
offset the emissions of the fossil fuel state, essentially. Like it feels like it doesn't matter how much you scream from the rooftops around it about this thing, because as long as, like, I don't know, essentially incompetent, visionless people who apparently are in positions of powers are not interested in attacking the systemic drivers underpinning all of this, nothing's going to change.
Well, I have my own answer to this, but why do you think that is?
Why do I think that is? Evidence. Why do I think what bit of it? Why do I think they're visionless? Why do I think they're
No, no,
systemic
no.
drivers?
Why do you think that
Or
nothing changes, especially regarding carbon credits? They've been debunked. They've been. I
yeah,
mean, lots of them have been very thoroughly debunked. Why do
yeah.
we still use them?
I think there's layers to it. So I think that there is sort of like nefarious interest in propping up a solution that allows us to continue the system as it is, all in the guise of greenwashing, of essentially saying that we're doing something, which is what the public needs to see right now. I think that there is a deep fear about transitioning away from fossil fuels. I believe that politicians, they don't have a plan. And they sort of like maybe vaguely understand that it does end this current world order. Like you can kiss goodbye to empire when we turn away from fossil fuels, because it is the lifeblood of empire.
Mm.
And I think beyond that, I don't like to think that people are evil, because I think, again, that's sort of like, it's too easy, right? It's just too easy making a them and us and saying that people are evil. The reason that I say that these people are sort of visionless is that there are these like growth drivers built into our economic system. I don't know very much about it, but this relationship between like debt and credit and economic growth, meaning that we constantly have to expand the economy, in order to avoid recession, in order to avoid things collapsing, civilization collapsing, and all this kind of stuff. And there just seems to be an inherent lack of understanding that those kinds of things are going to happen anyway, because you're going to continue burning fossil fuels and there's going to continue being warming. So
Mm-hmm.
you might as well manage the descent. Like hold on to the plane's, I don't know, a wheel. What does a plane have? Hold on to the plane's thing while it's crashing to try and minimize whatever damage or mitigate whatever damage we can, because it's going to crash either way.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think a mix of like system dynamics, lack of ignorance, and then only at the very top, actual sort of nefarious corruption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I agree. I mean,
Mm.
I was thinking about it a bit more narrowly than how it's entangled with empire. But I would say that carbon credits are the one thing that can give an individual who cares about climate change the comfort that they're doing something. And if you take it away, then they will have absolutely nothing. I think that that might be a good thing, because as I said earlier, I think the question of um, how to stop climate crises is one that governments need to solve, and they're not going to, which means that future disasters are inevitable. But being able to click a button and offset your emissions and say that you did not contribute to the problem, maybe that desensitizes you to the fact that disaster is coming.
Oh, interesting. I'd never thought about it from that end. I don't know how many people think about or use carbon credits. or click that button to offset their emissions. It's very hard to know when you must feel this way too, when you're like deep in the thing. It's very hard to know what public consensus is
That's
on a
true.
matter.
I don't know, but I'd find the idea of them appealing. I just happen to have read a lot about them and know that they're not the solution.
Yeah. I think it's a good moment to throw in here as well that despite, carbon credits being debunked 10 years ago and continuously for the past 10 years, and those kinds of investigations becoming like globally public in the past few years, the United Nations and the European Parliament are currently in the process of creating their own framework for biodiversity credits and biodiversity markets and methane credits, I found out this morning, and water pollution credits, air pollution credits. The financialization of the damage we are doing, maybe the financialization of externalization, is not slowing down in face of scientific evidence and in face of warning from scientists and journalists alike. It is getting worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're right.
Yeah. Sorry, I keep sort of taking us off on like little angry tangents.
I don't mind it. I think it's good to hear. It's your show.
The show. Yeah. The world is ending. No, I'm kidding, everyone. Everything's fine.
You asked earlier who's responsible, and I mentioned the UN, and I mentioned the UNFCCC and how they didn't respond to any questions about any specific projects, and they didn't respond to whether they would investigate any of the low quality projects and project types we brought to them, or revise their claim of being climate neutral. They didn't get back to us on that. They only told us that they rely on the standards of the Clean Development Mechanism, which have pretty much been debunked. But now that I've mentioned the UNFCCC, I think that brings us back to why we at the New Humanitarian in Mongabay investigated this question in the first place, because the UNFCCC is the entity that buys carbon credits on behalf of most other UN entities, and then allows them through those purchases to claim to be climate neutral. It's also the UN entity that is most involved in the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, that is most involved in the Paris Agreement, that puts on the annual COP meetings. It's the most relevant UN entity to the global effort to do something about climate change. And it's also the one that is operating on very outdated information about carbon credits and whether it's even possible to achieve climate neutrality. It might also be some of the sources we interviewed, some experts said they're greenwashing. They're misleading the public by saying they're climate neutral. I don't think you want an organization that is misleading the public about its achievements at addressing the climate crisis to necessarily be the one leading the global effort to do something about the climate crisis. There's a disconnect there, and we wanted them to address that. They didn't, but I think that if there's one point that I hope readers will take from this, it would be that, that tension.
Very well put. I think this is kind of what the public, especially the public that's sort of like plugged into all of the different problems that we're sort of facing, these like social justice problems, essentially. Environment is one of them. What are we going to do given the organizations in charge are sort of seemingly incapable of responding? How many years are going to go by whilst we still believe what is now obvious sort of deception, whether it's deliberate or not? And when are these organizations going to come out and say that they don't actually have the solutions in order to better collaborate with one another to figure out what to do. Because, I mean, I was at a thing recently and there was a really lovely woman from the UN and she's working on the biodiversity market. I think she's at the UNFCCC. And, you know, this poor woman, I hammered her. I was like, yeah, but why? What? How? The research, you know, we've already seen that biodiversity market testing in Australia has been harmful to local environment and indigenous people. We've already, like, look at the history of carbon credits. Like, this is a mechanism that just doesn't work. And I said, you know, it doesn't work and it is going to cause, or at least be partly responsible for us not mitigating in time and seeing huge destruction all around the world. And she gets it. You know, she really is doing her best. She's deeply passionate about the climate crisis. She's deeply passionate about social justice issues. She's deeply passionate about trying to find a solution. And essentially, like, the Overton window of possibility that has been given to her within this organization is, you know, offsetting, run with it, go, do. And when you have people with good intentions like that working on developing the thing, and then you've got, you know, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, screaming his head off at world leaders that they are essentially committing mass murder. I mean, that is now what he is saying. Like, you are not doing enough. We are all going to die. You just got to wonder what is happening in all of those chains of commands. If, like, the top boss gets it and the workers in the offices get it, what is happening that still these bad decisions are being made? How effective can these organizations be? How effective can these good intentions truly be? There's obviously some structural problem.
Yeah, I think that's something that I'm also desperate to understand, considering that the UNFCCC was generous to me in supplying the data, but when I asked them, or when I pointed out to them that it undermined their advertising, they went silent for a long time and then got back to us with a very, very brief answer that didn't answer most of our questions. Yeah, I don't doubt that they know what I'm getting at, but something prevented them from answering my questions. Some force that I don't understand yet.
I'd love to see your list of questions.
Okay, you can see them.
I'd like, yeah, and their answer in full. In fact, could you send me that? Because I'd quite like to publish it along with the episode info, if that's all right.
That's I think that's an interesting request. Let me talk to my superiors. I don't have a problem with it.
Great. That would be, it would just be great to see. I think so often in, like, journalistic investigations, this is the kind of info that the public don't get to see. They don't get to see how it happens.
That's very interesting. I think I'm into it. Let me get permission though.
Oh, wicked. Cool. It's the first time I've asked it. It was a very spontaneous request. But yeah, that whole, like, so-and-so did not respond to request for comment, or so-and-so said X. It's like, you don't, like, do people understand how much they're refusing to answer in that, by giving that sentence or by not replying to that email? Yeah, great. Oh, great. That'd be fun. I hope your superiors say yes.
Okay. Yeah, me too.
All right, Jacob. I mean, I think that unless you just want to keep banging on together about how institutions are broken, we've probably got it all. I suppose there is one thing. I thought about this before jumping on with you, actually. Given the UNFCCC did not respond to those emails, and given the history of reporting on carbon credits, what do you hope your investigation will achieve?
Yeah, that's a good question. One thing that makes it hard to answer is that I feel like someone should have asked the question that prompted our investigation 10 years ago. And I think then there was more appetite for someone to do something about faulty, low-quality carbon credits. Now, yeah, as you said, nothing really happens every time they're criticized. But I'm hoping that the UN will ultimately be responsive. I'm hoping that the UN, especially the UNFCCC, which is the most responsible for leading the effort to address climate change on a global stage, that they'll be responsive to science and that they will somehow address the concerns that address the questions we originally brought to them. So they could do that in a few ways. They could investigate the offsetting projects that were linked to environmental damage or human rights abuses or displacement, and they could publish their findings. They could investigate the quality of the carbon credits they bought using more up-to-date standards, not just the ones from the Clean Development Mechanism. They could revise their claim of being climate neutral, because that claim implies that they don't contribute to climate change. And that is a very bold claim. And when you make it based on low quality carbon credits, like many of the experts told us, you are misleading the public. You are promoting a solution to the climate crisis that does not work. So I would like to see them revise their climate neutrality claim. And we'll find out at the end of November when they release their next Greening the Blue report, which is an annual report where they say how much greenhouse gas they've emitted over the previous year and how many carbon credits they bought and whether they're climate neutral. Let's see if that changes.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And on a perhaps more general level, do you ever think about or have any ideas about maybe how journalism needs to reform itself? Because, I mean, the amount of us doing really hard work, producing these investigations, doing these investigations on really pertinent topics that then just get lost to the wind. What can we do about that?
That is a question that that tortures me in a few ways. Like, on the one hand, I don't think I'm very important. I come at it for better or for worse with humility. Like, I don't think I'm the best journalist in the world. I don't think my reporting is going to change the world. I approach the job and perhaps come up in the industry at a time when more people think this way. That I think it's an amazing profession, but the chances of having the type of impact that will avert climate disaster are very, very low. I think it's just the best I can do. That's it. It's the best anyone can do. The skill set I bring to issues of global concern is journalism. That's all I have. I hope it works. I hope it does something good. But if it doesn't, I won't be surprised, unfortunately.
Yeah, understood. All right, Jacob, thank you so much for your time today. This has been fascinating. Always keen to get these particular stories around the full solutions being peddled around today. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
I would like to platform a couple of reporters who I don't know. Their names are Sue Branford and Mauricio Torres. They published an article in Mongabay, who was my reporting partner in my investigation, called "Is Brazil Greenwashing Hydropower? The Case of the Teles Pires Dam." So the investigation that I worked on touched on some of the harmful impacts of the Teles Pires Dam, that hydropower dam in the Amazon. Their article goes deeper into the harm it's been accused of, the indigenous communities that have been affected, and comes at it from a different perspective, not looking at the quality necessarily of their carbon credits, but the fact that there is a dark side to hydropower. That's not a new idea, but I think it is. It was helpful for me to know the details, and I think your listeners could benefit from it too, and also go more deeply into one aspect of my investigation that I think is very useful.
Excellent. Thank you. Jacob, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you too.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.